Three armed strangers were bleeding beneath the scorching Georgia sun, while hundreds of cars had already driven past without stopping. Everyone believed they were too dangerous to save. But then an 18-year-old mechanic's apprentice stepped out of the woods carrying nothing except a rusty toolbox and a bottle of water. He looked at the men, ignored the fear in their eyes, and quietly said, "If I leave now, none of you will survive." What happened over the next few hours shocked an entire state, and 2 weeks later, thousands of motorcycles surrounded his tiny hometown for a reason nobody expected. Ethan Carter had spent his whole life believing that kindness never made anyone rich. At 18, he worked every day inside a small repair garage in rural Georgia, earning barely enough to buy groceries for himself and his grandmother, Martha. College had become nothing more than a dream folded inside an old acceptance letter hidden beneath his mattress. Every morning he fixed engines. Every evening he repaired broken fences for neighbors to pay for Martha's medicine. He never imagined that choosing one unfamiliar road on a blazing Thursday afternoon would place him directly in the middle of a mystery that would change his life forever. The road Ethan chose that afternoon was rarely used by anyone except truck drivers and hunters. Tall pine trees blocked the sunlight, and there wasn't a single house for miles. As he walked home, he suddenly heard a weak cry for help carried by the wind. At first he thought it was an injured animal, but the desperate voice came again, this time louder. Hidden behind the trees were four enormous bikers, their hands tied with heavy chains around thick pine trunks. Their motorcycles stood abandoned nearby, while blood stained the dry ground beneath them. One man's face was covered in cuts. Another could barely breathe. A third had lost consciousness. The oldest among them looked straight at Ethan and whispered, "Kid, leave. The men who did this are still close." Ethan's heartbeat raced. He had no weapon, no phone signal, and no idea who had attacked them. Walking away meant staying alive. Staying meant risking everything. He slowly placed his worn toolbox on the ground, took one deep breath, and stepped toward the chained strangers, unaware that someone hidden in the forest was silently watching his every move. Ethan ignored the warning and rushed to the man who looked closest to death. Years of working at the repair garage had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, and that instinct took over. He soaked his only clean cloth with the last of his drinking water and pressed it against the injured man's head to slow the bleeding. Then he searched the chains, noticing they had been locked with industrial padlocks while thick zip ties cut into the biker's wrists. Using the small cutting blade from his old toolbox, Ethan carefully sliced through the plastic restraints, giving them enough movement to breathe without tearing their skin. But the heavy chains refused to break. The oldest biker watched every move with surprising calm, studying Ethan as though judging his character instead of his skills. Suddenly, fresh tire tracks appeared on the dirt road nearby, followed by the distant sound of an engine. The attackers, or someone else, was coming back. Ethan had only seconds to decide whether to run for his own life or stay beside four strangers whose real identities remained a complete mystery. The engine grew louder until a black pickup truck rolled onto the dirt road and stopped just beyond the trees. Ethan froze, convinced the attackers had returned. But instead of armed robbers, an elderly farmer stepped out, staring in disbelief at the horrifying scene. Ethan shouted for him to call 911, only to remember there was no cell signal anywhere on that road. Without wasting another second, the farmer sped away toward the nearest highway while Ethan continued fighting to save the strangers. He searched every motorcycle, hoping to find tools that could cut the chains. Inside one saddlebag, hidden beneath a rain cover, he discovered a compact bolt cutter. Working with shaking hands, he snapped the first chain, then the second. The injured bikers collapsed onto the ground, barely conscious but finally free. As sirens echoed faintly in the distance, the oldest biker slowly stood despite his injuries and looked directly into Ethan's eyes. Instead of thanking him, he quietly asked one unexpected question, "Son, has anyone ever told you that courage can change the fate of an entire town?" Ethan had no idea that this stranger already knew exactly who he was, and had just made a life-changing decision.
These chisels, made from copper and arsenic, were struck against the stones with wooden hammers. After many hours of hard work, the huge stones were shaped into the required forms. Challenge number 4, the the special type of stone now known as limestone was being cut in the city of Tura, around 250 kilometers away from the pyramid construction site at Giza. The problem was how to transport these stones. Each stone weighed 50 tons, equal to 50,000 kilograms, which was approximately the weight of 3 passenger buses. Hundreds of thousands of such stones had to be brought to the pyramid. No animal of that era could have handled such enormous weight, and they had no modern vehicles. Even if this work had to be done in today's modern world, a transport company would charge a huge amount for it. Surprisingly, this task was completed with the help of rivers and boats. The river between Tura and Giza was used, and the stones were loaded onto large boats and transported to the pyramid construction site. Experts believe that this work was not easy at all.
Garrett Sullivan was not an ordinary biker. Within 48 hours, his investigators uncovered every detail about Ethan's life. They learned about the tiny house with the leaking roof, his grandmother Martha's expensive medication, the acceptance letter to Georgia Tech he couldn't afford, and the endless overtime he worked just to keep food on the table. Yet the report ended with one sentence that impressed Garrett more than anything else: subject has never accepted money for helping others. Garrett closed the file and made another decision. He wouldn't reward Ethan with cash, he would change his future forever. 2 weeks later, the quiet town awoke to a thunderous roar unlike anything its residents had ever heard. Thousands of motorcycles stretched across the highway, filling every street with chrome and rumbling engines. Neighbors rushed outside in disbelief as rider after rider entered town carrying construction tools, medical supplies, and scholarship documents. Ethan stepped onto his porch, stunned by the endless convoy. Then Garrett removed his helmet, smiled, and said, "Today isn't about repaying a favor, it's about honoring a man who reminded us what real courage looks like." Garrett led Ethan through the crowd until they reached a temporary stage built in the center of town. Thousands of riders stood silently as cameras from across the state recorded every moment. Garrett took the microphone and revealed the truth no one had expected. Years earlier, his own son had died after strangers ignored him on a lonely highway, and since that day he had promised to honor anyone brave enough to help others without expecting a reward. Then he turned toward Ethan and announced the first surprise: a full engineering scholarship, guaranteed internship, and complete medical care for Martha for the rest of her life. Before Ethan could recover, Garrett pointed toward the old abandoned building on Main Street. "Tomorrow," he said, "construction begins on a free vocational training center, and it will proudly carry one name: the Ethan Carter Community Academy." The crowd erupted in applause, but Ethan stood speechless with tears in his eyes. Just when he thought the surprises were over, a sheriff walked onto the stage holding a sealed evidence box. Inside was something recovered from the crime scene, something that proved the attack on Garrett had never been a random robbery at all. The sheriff opened the evidence box and placed a damaged leather bag on the table. Inside were maps, handwritten notes, and photographs proving that the attackers had been targeting charity convoys traveling through rural towns for months. Garrett looked at Ethan and explained that if he had not stopped that day, the criminals would have escaped forever with information that could have endangered countless future missions. Ethan's courage had saved not only 4 lives but also protected thousands of families who depended on the Brotherhood's humanitarian work. Weeks later, the gang responsible was arrested after investigators used the evidence recovered at the scene. Meanwhile, construction of the Ethan Carter Community Academy began, bringing new jobs, training, and hope to the forgotten town. Ethan finally entered Georgia Tech with a full scholarship, while Martha watched proudly from the front row during his first award ceremony. Before leaving campus, Garrett placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and quietly said, "The greatest heroes aren't the strongest, they're the ones who stop when everyone else keeps driving." If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unforgettable true style stories.